This video, as always, is brought to you by Badge of Honor Clothing. You guys can check them out at badgeofhonorcode.com, and don't forget to use the code SCRAP20 to get 20% off your order. Whether you're looking at buying a rash guard, a t-shirt, a hoodie, this is clothing for martial artists by martial artists, Badge of Honor. Be sure to check them out with discount code SCRAP20. Bryan Battle is entering the TUF 29 finale this weekend, taking on Gilbert Urbina, a last-minute replacement for Trayshawn Gore, who is another standout Atlantic South fighter, much like Battle. I've been lucky enough to commentate several of Bryan's fights on the Fight For promotion and followed his career closely as a local favorite, so I figured I'd talk to you guys a little bit about Bryan's career in MMA so far leading up to the TUF finale and what we can expect from him in this fight against Urbina, and show you why Bryan Battle went from last pick to potentially the last man standing when it's all said and done on TUF 29. Bryan first entered the MMA sphere in 2016 when he walked through the doors of Hayastan MMA. At the time, Bryan was close to 300 pounds and had not partaken in sports since high school football or basketball. Hayastan MMA is a standout gym within the North Carolina MMA scene. If you've attended any of our regional shows, you know that this is one of the most dangerous corners you can find yourself across from as a coach or a fighter. And Bryan's personality and his tenacity for training put him right at home in this room full of killers. The weight started to steadily come off. He settled in around 240 and he began taking amateur fights at heavyweight. His first bout was a KO loss that actually went viral on social media at the time. This would be enough to deter most guys from lacing up the gloves again, but according to Hayastan coach Tom Ziegler, Bryan was right back in the gym the next week and talking about making 205 in future fights. This was the first sign for Coach Ziegler that Bryan might have what it takes to eventually make it to the pro level. Battle went on to win 7 straight amateur bouts before debuting as a pro on Fight For It 7 in July of 2019. He mopped the floor with Zach Dallin for 3 straight rounds and looked great. His next fight was at the LP Friends Stadium at the highly controversial Fight For It 8. MMA bouts were moved during the show from the MMA cage into the boxing ring due to problems with the moisture and humidity in the air, making the cage too unsafe to fight in. Battle faced former Wonder Boy training camp member Nicholas Overblood Martino, losing via armbar in the first minute of the fight. Since then, however, Bryan has not missed a beat, taking down 4 straight opponents, finishing each man inside 2 rounds. His fight with Ben Fowler was especially entertaining and punched his ticket to the TUF 29 tryouts, where he fought from his position as last pick for Team Volkanovski, all the way to the finale versus Urbina. Hayastan MMA is a gym very centered around grappling first and foremost. The gym's training philosophy is handed down from its founder, Sensei Gokor Chivichian. Chivichian is an expert in judo, sambo, catch wrestling, and jiu-jitsu. He is considered by many to be one of the most complete grapplers of all time. It shows in the results of his students. If you watch other Hayastan MMA standouts just from the Charlotte location, like Shamik Harvey or Josh Motzinger, you'll see a very dynamic and almost Dagestani-like approach to the groundwork. If you haven't heard of Gokor before now, I strongly suggest you look into him if you're a fan of submission grappling like I am. This style meshes with Bryan well, and his grappling has contributed heavily to many of his AMI and pro level wins, but where Bryan differs from many of his Hayastan brethren is in the striking department, as the Battle Master is just as much of a threat on the feet as he is along the cage wall. Bryan likes to use the jab and front kicks to probe and open up other options, such as the teep to the body, and maybe even bait a reaction from his opponent. But striking wise, he doesn't do a lot of standing still. He likes to wade forward with aggression and create a blitz. This blitz is usually centered around coming in behind his 1-2, throwing hooks, jabbing to split the guard. Eventually he will look to clinch. He's an expert clincher. He can mix in wrestling very well. He's comfortable clinching you in the open field or along the cage wall. Usually he's going to back people up along the cage wall, and then he's going to look to create a grappling scenario that will eventually end in a takedown. Once again, very Dagestani oriented style of wrestling. Not really looking for a lot of blast doubles in the open field, more along the lines of, we're going to push you back to the wall and then we're going to drag you to the ground. He's also an expert at creating brawls. He does this by throwing volume and constantly moving forward, of course, but he has a great stepping left body kick that he can also throw switch, and easily he can feint this into a head kick or a calf kick, and this forces opponents to react in some kind of way. Most of the time, they're either going to leave kicking range by just disengaging, or engaging directly, moving forward past the kick range, which puts him into another scrap with Battle, which is what Bryan wants. Alternatively, they can also try and take him down off of the kicks. Bryan also welcomes this, especially after his TUF run. His takedown defense saw some really great strides, and his defensive wrestling along the cage wall also looks markedly better since he showed up at the TUF House, in my opinion, especially in that Andre Petrosky fight. Battle showed an incredible improvement in his feints as well under the guidance of Volkanovski. I can definitely tell that the striking with Coach Volkanovski is paying dividends for him. He's also got a great counter-striking game that I think is probably the most underrated aspect of his game. He doesn't really do this in the most obvious way of a traditional counter-striker. He doesn't stay long and sniperish in the way of a Conor McGregor or an Israel Adesanya. Instead, Bryan uses head movements, shoulder rolls, and timing to expertly counter-strike in the heat of a brawl. A lot of Bryan's game is about creating a storm, a brawl, an exchange, and using it to tire the other guy out. It's a very similar strategy that Justin Gaethje employed early on, but Bryan does it without taking half the damage of the human highlight reel Gaethje. Battle, like Gaethje, is also an extremely brutal and effective fighter in the clinch, consistently mixing in knees to the head and body and using his long frame and limbs to strike with that knee to the head in a lot of areas where guys would otherwise feel safe, as demonstrated when Andre Petrosky thought Battle headbutted him when he actually got kneed standing almost straight up. Of course, that does bring us to Bryan's frame. When Bryan first started training, as I mentioned earlier, he was close to 300 pounds, and he took a couple of his first fights at heavyweight in the amateur ranks. Over the years, that weight came off, and eventually he began making 205 and then found a home as a pro at 185. And he seems to be one of the longest and strongest guys in that division on the regional scene. There's not a lot of guys with his body type that make it out of the regional scene at 185. They're mostly at 205 and then eventually find themselves like Cannonier did at 185. But with the Battle, he's very young, already able to make 185 with what seems like no issues based on his TUF run. And you compare his stats at 6'2" with a reach of 77 inches to former champion and all-time great middleweight, in my opinion, Robert Whittaker, who stands at 6 foot even with a reach of just 73 inches, and you start to understand why Battle could be a problem to most people in this division out the gate on just his physiology alone. So, of course, what can we expect out of Bryan this weekend? Well, obviously, I think Bryan's striking has improved a lot since his time on the regional circuit here in the Carolinas. I think that training with Volkanovski and getting that city kickboxing style approach to his work has definitely changed a lot of his looks in striking, and now he's taking those same tools that he's always been a fond of, that body kick, the front kicks, the 1-2 blitz. He's taking those and he's threatening them in new ways and feinting with them in new ways that I think is going to make it very confusing for Urbina, especially on 10 days notice. It's going to be a very tough fight for Urbina, in my opinion. Battle, the one criticism that you can have about Battle is that he does get a little sloppy in the striking sometimes, and he takes a little bit of unnecessary damage. Even against guys that he's handily beaten, or beating at the moment, he's willing to put himself in risky scenarios where he takes big shots at the risk of getting one for himself. And that's obviously well and good as long as you're winning fights, and it obviously makes for an entertaining fighter. I mean, I think if you watch enough of Bryan's fights, you'll realize that the first minute of them are just a storm, and it's about can you survive that storm, and when the storm is over, what do you look like? Do you look like some of his previous opponents and just exhausted after the first 2 minutes of a competitive fight, and where Bryan's still ready to go, or are you less tired than Bryan is? So Bryan fighting his ideal fight is going full blast for 2 minutes and then just laying it on for the rest of the time. From what I've seen in his history, obviously it's been a long time since those TUF fights were recorded. We could be looking at a completely different fighter for both guys, really. Urbina and Battle could both be giving us completely new looks, considering how young both guys are and how much is on the line with this one fight. They might try a strategy that they've never had before. But if I know those highest on MMA guys, if I know the corner, if I know Coach Ziegler and Coach Kevin Ferrant, Coach Tony Tan, I know what they're going to bring to the table as far as Bryan Battle is concerned, and it's going to be what got them to the TUF finale.